In March of 1892, Malachi Buchanan, also known as Chigga, attempted suicide at his home at 1713 Church Street in Nashville by drinking an ounce of laudanum. He refused to have his stomach pumped, but was saved nonetheless by a remedy administered by a hypodermic needle. Although not a drinker, Chigga had been on a bender prior to this attempt. This is one of just a long list of sad stories from back in the day when the 1700 block of Church Street in Nashville was a cluster of residential homes. Lots of deaths, a shooting, 2 young boys fell out of a tree on the property, 1 died. But by 1953, the residential area had become a commercial one, with a series of long and narrow 2,400 square foot cinder block buildings filling up about half of the long block. Nashville in the early 1950s was like any other small southern city, buttoned up and happy with the status quo. The downtown was thriving, old moneyed families controlled commerce and politics, public schools and lunch counters were still segregated, and being gay was a crime, with laws written and justified by Christian beliefs. This open hostility led to the creation of spaces where the gay community could come together safely. Nashville bars, opened in rundown, lightly traveled, and industrial areas, became these spaces, their out-of-the-way locations rendering them invisible to most Nashvillians. And they offered more than just drinks and a good time. They also offered acceptance, support, and fortitude. First, there was the Jungle and the Leopard, a nightclub and a bar that Warren Jett opened in 1952. He hired Juanita Brazier to run the bar and eventually named it after her. Juanita was a fierce and early defender of gay rights, bailing out patrons who had been arrested for quote-unquote disorderly conduct and proudly displaying on a shelf behind the bar the numerous bricks thrown through the windows. In 1971, Jerry Peake opened the drag bar Watch Your Coat and Hat Saloon. Peake didn't advertise because he was trying to avoid unwanted attention, but when it opened, the lines went around the block. When Watch Your Coat and Hat burned in 1973, the drag scene moved to the Cabaret in Printers Alley, which at that time was a major downtown adult entertainment area for tourists and a hangout for local politicians and reporters. The drag shows at the Cabaret were considered more adult entertainment than gay, and the bar was frequented by both gay and straight clientele. After 2 years in Printers Alley, the Cabaret moved to 1711 Hayes Street, a more out-of-the-way area located directly behind the increasingly more desolate 1700 block of Church Street, which by this time had been cut off from downtown Nashville by I-40. In this location, the Cabaret was now in a more safe place, and it began operating strictly as a gay bar. In April of 1979, Steve Smith and Michael Dolly Wilson opened Warehouse 28, a nightclub with a disco focus in an old tire repair store on Franklin Pike in the quiet neighborhood of Berry Hill. They chose this location because it was far away from prying eyes, but not far enough away. In July of that same year, someone threw a fireball through the back of the building. As communities often do in times of crisis, people came together to help, and the bar was able to reopen within just a few days. During the AIDS crisis of the 1980s, Wilson and Smith stepped in, and the Warehouse became even more of a hub for the gay community. With the federal, state, and local governments refusing or just failing to provide even basic medical information and guidance during this public health crisis, they decided that everyone who came to the club needed accurate information. And the Warehouse provided that info. These 4 Nashville spaces are historic and contributed enormously to the growth and development of the gay community in Nashville. But the story continued. In January of 1981, Howell Bartee opened the World's End at 1713 Church Street. When you went to the World's End, as New York-based writer Kay West did in 1981 when she was deciding whether or not to move here from New York, you experienced Nashville's hippest and most sophisticated bar. West wrote that the World's End offered a menu that was, quote, creative and contemporary, with a decent wine selection, an energetic vibe, and a sexually and racially diverse clientele. Throughout the 1980s, the World's End was well frequented by artists, creatives, and local music biz executives who were either looking for a hot new place or they wanted to feel like they weren't in Nashville. And maybe because of its hip reputation, or maybe because of its proximity to the cabaret on the street right behind it, or maybe a little bit of both, the World's End became another in a long line of safe spaces for Nashville's gay community. By 1992, the World's End had been open for over a decade, and it was a well-known but still relatively hush-hush hangout for Nashville's gay community. And then everything began to change. In the 1980s and before, any unequivocal advocacy for gay rights would derail almost any political career, let alone the career of a presidential candidate. But in 1992, Bill Clinton decided to specifically include gay men and women in his list of constituencies. For the first time ever, gay Americans had a candidate who was a strong advocate for their rights. When he was elected, gay and lesbian leaders described it as a historic moment in the history of gay politics. Urvashi Vaid, the executive director of the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, said, "This is a rite of passage for the gay and lesbian movement. For the first time in our history, we're going to be full and open partners in the government." At the same time that the fight for federal protections based on sexual orientation started to heat up, prominent gay rights activists and attorneys in Nashville were challenging state and local laws, including the constitutionality of Tennessee's sodomy law, which made sodomy illegal for same-sex adults, but said nothing of sodomy for heterosexuals. At the same time, they were fighting for equal protections for employees, renters, parents, and domestic partners who could be discriminated against based on sexual orientation. In the early 90s, if you were gay, you could be fired, evicted, lose custody of your children. The terror was real. But now, with an ally in the White House for the first time, the demand for equality and rights became louder and louder and louder. It was during this time in 1992, right on the cusp of all this change, that Lucy's record shop opened right next door to the World's End. Lucy and I made a bunch of new and fun and wonderful friends. Some popped in before their shift or would come by during a break. People that went there would pop by too. Michele Crow, who was a server at the time, would often come by to hang out. And we talked recently about what it was like for her to be gay in Nashville in the late 80s and the early 90s.
So I came out of the closet in 86. I'm one of those weirdos that I didn't know that I was gay until I knew that I was gay. And then when I knew, I knew. But I met the very first girl I was ever with. We were together for like 3 years. And she had a boyfriend at the time. Me and her and our roommates went to go watch, I think it was Rocky Horror Picture Show, and we drank a little bit of tequila. And
a little bit.
And when we got back to the dorm, we lived in one of those high rises on campus. And at the time, I'm sure it's not the case now, but at the time you could go up and get on the roof. And so we decided that the four of us were going to grab some blankets and pillows and sleep up there. So our roommates went to do that, and she asked me if I would kiss her, and I freaked out. I was like, I can't kiss you, you're a girl. Freaked out. And then right after that, though, I was like, damn it, I wish I'd kissed her. And then eventually, obviously, we did. And, you know, she was my first girlfriend, and neither one of us had ever been with a woman before. So it was like a whole brand new learning experience.
Did you just, did
Well,
a light, like a switch get flipped or a light bulb go off?
it was more like this feeling that for the first time, like, because I had dated a few boys, like in high school and stuff. And that felt like what you were just supposed to do, but it never, like, that whole take your breath away moment. I just never really had that with a guy. But the very first time I kissed her, it was just a kiss, but the very first time I had that where it just felt like this is the right place to be. And then the process itself, like, I mean, I would say, I mean, this was 1986 in Nashville, Tennessee, so very conservative. I mean, all the gay clubs back then, they were completely blacked out windows and stuff. Like, you had to be gay or know a gay person to know where the gay clubs were, because you weren't just going to be like, flashing lights and stuff like it is now on Church Street, like those clubs that are down there, Tribe and whatever. That would never have existed back in the 80s, because somebody would have come by with a gun and probably shot it up. I mean, that's just a fact. So it was a little bit scary. You had to be very careful. I wasn't able to walk down the street holding my girlfriend's hand. I mean, I remember one time being down at the Underground on 2nd Avenue, and me and this girl I was dating we had gone to my car for something, and we were kissing, and a cop came up to my window and hit the window of my car so hard I thought it was going to shatter. And it scared me to death, so I turned and looked at him, and he goes, "You either quit doing that right now or I'm going to take you to jail."
Oh, whoa.
Yeah. So that's the kind of stuff that happened. Like, my first girlfriend's mother outed me to my mom. I had not come out to my family yet. And so my mom called me while I was at work and asked me to come talk to her. So I was terrified, because I'm going to tell you right now, in a gay person's life, that is the most terrifying moment, when you're about to come out to your family. She called and she said, so I got a weird phone call the other day. And I was like, "From who?" And she goes, her mom's name. And I was like, "Oh, what'd you say?" And what'd she say? And I was like, we went back and forth. Finally, she was like, "Will you just come talk to me, please?" And I was like, but she told me, she said, "Well, she said that you guys were having a lesbian affair." And those words coming out of my mother's mouth, I was like, but I mean, I went and talked to her, and mostly my mom, I've got the greatest family in the world as far as I'm concerned, but my mom asked me if a man had ever hurt me, if that was why. And I said no. I mean, a lot of women out there, bad things have happened to them. So, but I'm fortunate that that's not been the case for me. And I said, no, that hasn't happened. And she asked me if one of the guys that I had dated before had done something or upset me in a way that maybe would have lended me that way. And I said, no, not really. And she goes, "Well, do you think that you're gay?" And at that point, I gave her my most honest answer, which was, I don't know. Because I didn't know 100% at that point. I knew that I wanted to be with her and that I loved her, but I didn't know if I was going to be all women or how that was going to work for me. And I really thought that her and I were going to be together forever.
First love.
First love, first love.
Was her mother tattling on you two in a way?
She was basically trying to get me in trouble, and because she didn't want me and Leslie together, because her daughter wasn't gay. And I was like, well, she's gay right now. But her mom finally chilled out. Like, gosh, she was a crazy person. She would call us like at 5 o'clock in the morning and be like, "You're going to hell on a speedboat," and all this like crazy shit. And she wasn't even a religious person. That's what was so funny about it. It was like, and she had friends, like gay guy friends that she would go out to clubs with and stuff, but she just didn't want her daughter to be gay. So, but she finally chilled out. Probably the second year we were together. Like, I mean, Leslie and I actually moved down to Alabama for a minute. We were going to go to school down there. We'd go hang out with her parents house and stuff. So, but she chilled out, but she was just a crazy person for a minute. The other thing that my mom said, though, that kind of gave me the courage to just go ahead and be who I am, was she said, "Well, it's not the life I would have chosen for you because of society." She said, "But you're my daughter and I love you. And if anybody has anything bad to say to you, they're going to have to come through me first." So once I got that, and my dad was like well, are you happy? And I'm like, yeah, I'm happy. He goes, okay, be happy. That was his response. But brother and sister were a little bit weird about it at first. But I mean, this has been 30 something years, Mary. So everybody's cool now. They don't give a shit. It's whatever.
Maybe not everybody's families reacted the same way as yours did. And
Oh, for sure,
so,
no. I mean, I knew a bunch of people in that community that their parents had basically disowned them. Yeah, I mean, I don't, now that I am a parent, I cannot imagine something that my son would do or say or anything that I would be like, I never want to see you again. Like, I can't even imagine that. But I guess some people's religious views or something are just so strong that they just can't accept it. I don't know. I don't know how somebody can feel that way. But I've seen it. I know people that just, they don't have a family. It's really sad. My mom used to say all the time, she's like, well, you bring them here. You bring them here. She'd be their mama. We bring them, you bring them for Thanksgiving or Christmas. Don't you let them be there by themselves. So, I'm lucky that that's the kind of people I was raised by. So, but, when I came out in 86, there were nobody certainly on TV. There were no stars anywhere that had come out as gay. I mean, the whole Rock Hudson thing and all that stuff when he contracted AIDS and stuff, but he was straight. He was straight, and we didn't find out 2 years later that he wasn't. But I think that all of that has made it easier too. When these people start like, what's that? Her name was Ellen Page, but now she goes by like something else. She's transitioned. Elliot Page. You've got people doing that now, transitioning in front of the world. That also had a lot to do with that big shift. Like, I'll tell people, they're like, oh, so you and Lucas's mom had to get divorced. And I'm like, no, there was no gay marriage back then. We couldn't get married. So let's say Bob and Dan were married for 40 years, right? And they had this home together and had all this stuff, but this was still before gay marriage, right? So then Dan passes away, but Dan's family comes and takes everything from the house because they're his next of kin. You see, like, and that kind of shit happened all the time. I mean, a human being that would do that to another human being, knowing the situation, that's just, you're a horrible person if you do something like that.
The Metropolitan Community Church was a Protestant Christian denomination founded in Los Angeles in 1968, specifically to proactively address the bigotry and exclusion practiced by other Christian denominations. Nashville eventually got its own MCC parish, and in 1976, they decided to hold Nashville's first gay pride event, a small picnic on the grounds of the church. Michele remembers what the Pride celebration looked like in the 1980s.
Back then, the prides in Nashville, oh my God, you were lucky if 500 people showed up. They were so tiny, But I was there because I wasn't afraid. Everybody, I was out, my family. You weren't going to, and I worked at a gay restaurant, so what are you going to strip away from me? That whole, like, being scary and being so conservative and, a lot of people were still dying from AIDS back then. It was just a really, it was, on one hand, it was like this magical time. I don't know if there was some special love bubble around that part of my world at that time, but those people are like my family still. They are family to me, and that's never going to change. It's beyond just being friendly and like, oh, hey, how you doing? We stay connected in each other's lives.
Sounds like you created your own community.
Absolutely. You had to. That was the only safe way to travel. You had to find your people so that you had enough of you that you knew you could be safe. So that's what I did. I surrounded myself with people, not necessarily all of them. I mean, not all of them were gay. I didn't give a shit about that. I didn't care if a person was gay or not. I cared if they were a good person. And so I feel like I just surrounded myself with all of this goodness and kindness and understanding and non-judgment, and that, and then I was fine because I didn't have to travel outside of that. There was enough people around me that it was safe.
Yeah.
Back then too, so many of the gay people I knew, especially the boys, they wouldn't come out to the march and stuff because it was fire at will, and they could straight up fire you for being gay, and there was nothing to do. So they didn't want to lose their jobs, so they wouldn't come out because the TV stations and stuff sometimes would come out and film, and if they got caught on TV, they were terrified their bosses would let them go. So there was you had to hide a lot back then. There was a lot of hiding, a lot of pretending when you were, I mean, I can only imagine these guys that were like, businessmen or whatever. They got to go to work, so they, put on their little straight guy face and their suit. And that was like one of the best things about moving down here is I finally just I got to be me. I didn't have to. And I didn't have to do a whole lot of that, putting on face, because again, I worked in the gay restaurant and had my community around me, but it still to some extent. I mean, if I went somewhere that wasn't around my people, like, for whatever reason, I definitely didn't talk about being gay. And I definitely didn't talk about my girlfriend or whatever. Like, there's no way I would have brought it up. Because a lot of places I worked there, I was surrounded by straight white men, I wasn't going to talk about it. Redneck white men at that. So never had any desire to have my ass kicked. Yeah. And that never happened to me. I think one time this happened in Nashville. I was living down here, and me and a buddy of mine took our girlfriends to Nashville for like a little weekend trip or whatever. And we went down to the honky tonks. And this guy was trying to hit on the two pretty girls. And I was like sitting there like, finally I said, man, they're with us. Like, he's like, what do you mean? I'm like, they're with us. And he was like, oh, fucking lesbian. And I'm like, listen, man, just go back to he was drunk. And I was like, just go back to your bar stool. You're going to be good. You'll meet somebody else. It's fine. And he was like, you want to take it outside?
Oh, jeez.
I started laughing. I was like, hell no, I don't want to take it outside. What are you talking about? He said, man, I just want to go back here and play some pool with my girlfriend. But yeah, stupid shit like that, and sometimes you forget about it till you start talking about it again, because it's so, but that stuff like that hasn't happened in a long time. Not here in Atlanta anyway. Now you go outside of Atlanta, it's a different story. But what I was missing, I think, was I wanted to live somewhere where I could walk down the street and hold my girlfriend. And I knew Atlanta was more progressive than Nashville by far. And the community was much larger here. The gay community was much larger. So when Stephen asked me to move here with him, at first I was kind of like, well, why would I do that? And he's like, what else do you have going on? And he was exactly right. I was kind of stuck, just working as a server. I never finished school at MTSU, so I just didn't have any plans. And so I was like, you know what, I'm going to do it. And it was the best decision I ever made. Because it really was like fantastic down here. It was just, it was the 90s, and there was like tons of gay women, and they were all like feminine, which was my thing. I liked feminine women. And so it was just like, wow, I thought I had dropped into paradise.
By 1993, the Pride Parade was about 1,000 strong. Members of the gay community and their allies marched the 2 miles from the state capitol downtown to Midtown Centennial Park. The parade went right by Lucy's and the World's End. And I remember watching from the sidewalk that afternoon and cheering on all the friends I had made from next door. The friends who, little by little, felt more and more comfortable about being in public with their friends and their partners and their lovers. Some were holding hands, and they were all celebrating their basic human right to be happy and to love who they wanted. So there we were, side by side, Lucy's and the World's End. We both provided a space where people could be themselves, and if they wanted to, they could organize against the power structures that conspired to keep them afraid and in hiding. But no matter how much the two communities had in common, there were big differences, and there was conflict. As Lucy's partner and booking agent Don Kendall said, there was intolerance on both sides. Management of the World's End complained about the kids hanging out on the sidewalk in front of the restaurant. They thought they were scaring away customers. They knew they were blocking the entrance. And even though the Lucy's motto was no racist, sexist, or homophobic shit tolerated, once in a while, a Lucy's kid would throw out an anti-gay slur. Looking back on it, though, it's clear that setting the house rules was an important step, especially because we were right next door to the World's End. As DG, another friend I met when he was a server at the World's End, told me recently, working next door at the time was not without incident, and tolerance was clearly something some kids were not learning at home. Lucy's subtly guided a whole subset of baby Nashvillians toward being better people, and did it ahead of the curve. He said, that means something. And there are a lot of us out here who, to this day, point to it as an example of a very early ally in the community. I asked Michele if she ever had any issues with the kids who came to Lucy's. She said she had a different experience.
A group of punk boys, they were army boys, and they came down from like, they were stationed up in Kentucky, and they started coming down probably that last year I lived in Nashville, and it was Mark was one of them. There was like 4 or 5 of them. They were really nice guys. Well, you know, at first they kind of came in like they're like going to kick everybody's ass and all this stuff, and then they kind of started hanging out with all of us. And I remember before I moved, I was down at the underground. You know, I don't know if you remember, that dance floor was like sunken, right? So it always had that little ledge that you could like sit on or whatever. So I was taking a break from dancing, and I was sitting there having a drink, and Mark was sitting next to me. And he said, listen, I know you're about to leave Nashville. And he said, I need to tell you something before you leave. I was like, okay, man, whatever. And he's like, I want to thank you. And I was like, okay, what? He said, well, you know, I'm going to admit that before I met you and some of the other people, he's like, I was really racist, and I was really racist about gay people. And he said, but I didn't know any. I'd never met any. I just thought, you know, ew. And I'm like, okay, well, some people feel that way. And he goes, but what I'm trying to say is you changed that. So It was really cool.
That's so cool. And that's so cool that he was able to express that to you too.
It only takes one person to maybe help one person. So maybe like what you can do to thank me even more is, as you move through life, like try to let other people know like your experience and why it's not that big of a deal, you know?
So much is different in Nashville today. There are so many gay-friendly businesses and restaurants. And although the World's End is no longer there, Church Street is still an LGBTQ plus destination. Canvas, a wonderfully laid-back gay bar, now occupies the former Lucy's space. A big garage door has replaced the front windows, and it opens up onto a lovely patio that's right on the street. A couple of blocks away is the popular Tribe and the drag bar Play. Nashville's Pride is now a 2-day celebration and is considered one of the largest in the South. The parade is held right in downtown Nashville on the tourist-packed Lower Broad, and this year drew about 20,000 marchers. There are numerous organizations that exist to support the community, and the public library has begun archiving its history. A marker now memorializes the site of the Jungle and Juanita's as the first gay bars in Nashville. One last thing. If it wasn't for Michele, Lucy would not have had a friend named Jack. Do you remember the Jack story? You found him, and then you brought him to Lucy's, and you said, Lucy needs a friend, and then you left. I was like, I guess I have 2 dogs now. I was like, Michele?
I didn't even ask, huh?
Pretty much no. No.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
But you know what? You were right. And he became just as much a shop, well, obviously a shop dog as Lucy. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Michele. I also want to thank D.G. Strong, Nikki Pendleton Wood, and John Bridges for helping to piece together some of this history. I also want to thank Philip Staffelli for all of the research he did for his master's thesis, The Queer Eye for Nashville, How LGBTQ People Form Community and Make Spaces and Places Like Everyone Else, which was used as a source document for this episode. This show is part of We Own This Town, a podcast network of original entertainment and documentary content. You can find more info at the official site at weownthistown.net or follow at We Own This Town on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. I also want to thank Michael Eads for the use of his studio and Lamb Chop for all the music that I used in this episode. Please visit the Lucy's website at lucysrecordshop.com for more information. And please subscribe to this podcast using any of the podcast platforms that are out there. Thanks for listening, everybody, and happy Pride.
Well, I want to be held, I want to be cuddled. I want to find me a real nice girl with a nice little waddle. Oh, neighborhood's getting better.